On October 30th, 2012, Walt Disney announced the acquisition of Lucasfilm for over $4 billion. It was a deal in the making for over a year when George Lucas first told Disney president Bob Iger about his plans for retirement. The deal gave Disney ownership of all of Lucasfilm's operating businesses, entertainment technologies, the intellectual property of Indiana Jones, and of course, Star Wars. Longtime Hollywood producer Kathleen Kennedy was appointed the president of Lucasfilm and quickly announced the production of new Star Wars films, beginning with Episode VII. At this time in 2012, The Clone Wars was still on Cartoon Network and well into its 5th season. Many fans were initially nervous about the fate of The Clone Wars under Disney's ownership and if it would remain on a competing Time Warner-owned network. What ended up happening was far worse. On March 11, 2013, an article was published on Stars.com entitled "A New Direction for Lucasfilm Animation." After 5 critically acclaimed seasons on Cartoon Network, Lucasfilm announced that the production of Star Wars The Clone Wars would be winding down. 2 unassuming words that were doublespeak for cancellation. The announcement promised that new Clone Wars episodes were on the way in the form of bonus content, but it failed to specify how many new episodes there would be, and if the series would reach its intended finale. And aside from the additional announcement that Seth Green's Star Wars Detours would be postponed, again, cancelled, that was everything the article stated. For this announcement to arrive only a little over a week after Ahsoka left the Jedi Order in the Season 5 finale, the sudden cancellation of the show felt like a stab in the back. All these years later, I'm still puzzled about the wording and briefness of the article, and why the cancellation of the show was treated with such a casual, hands-off tone. I think Disney failed to recognize how passionate and vocal the show's fanbase was, and completely misjudged their response. Even then, 13-year-old me was confused and conflicted, hesitant to believe that the cancellation was for the best. This leads us to a question that I've been eager to answer from the very first video when I started doing research for this series. Why was The Clone Wars cancelled? Truthfully, there's no definitive explanation for the show's cancellation, and there may never be. However, there are several likely reasons the show ended when it did, and a few different perspectives from creators who were involved in the show over the years. Because The Clone Wars was on a competing televised network, Disney had no interest in letting Cartoon Network continue airing Clone Wars episodes. This opened the door to putting Clone Wars on Disney XD, a network that, despite what you might hear, has almost the exact same intended age range as Cartoon Network. Even in 2016, the 20th season of Pokemon, which previously aired on Cartoon Network, was moved to Disney XD. So why didn't that happen with The Clone Wars? Over the course of the show, we know Lucas dedicated about $1 to $2 million per episode, which is above average compared to the spending of most animated TV shows. It's possible that by Season 5, the show cost even more than this because of pay raises. This measly $4 billion purchase of Lucasfilm may be nothing to scoff at compared to the $52 billion+ purchase of 21st Century Fox, but it was quite literally a big deal for Disney in 2012. Though Lucas executive produced the show's 5th and 6th seasons due to how far they were in production before the sale of Lucasfilm, the sale of Disney relinquished him of that role and presented Disney with a choice. Do we continue to produce the Clone Wars with a sky-high budget, or do we find a cheaper way to produce Lucasfilm animated content to an already built-in market? It seems that even months before the official cancellation of the show, Disney had made their choice. On May 20th, 2013, Lucasfilm Animation announced the production of Star Wars Rebels for Disney XD. Dave Filoni would be the showrunner, and many of his creative leads would carry over from the Clone Wars. While this seemed like some sort of promising follow-up, behind the scenes, Lucasfilm Animation was undergoing turbulent change. The studio was hit with at least 2 waves of layoffs, first to its crew departments, and then to the distribution and licensing departments. Even during Rebels' early development, members of Lucasfilm Animation had plans to leave the studio, including Darren Marshall, the lead character sculptor for the entire duration of the Clone Wars. There's practically zero data on the internet as to what Rebels' initial episodic budget was, but we do know that the first episode was completed in under a year, with the rest of the season likely completed in a similar space of time per episode. In comparison, the average time of development period from start to finish of a Clone Wars episode was 2 to 3 years. Even from a subjective judgment of the show's art style, everything we know suggests that Rebels had a much lower budget than Clone Wars, and that's exactly what Disney wanted. It might also be worth noting that every episode of Rebels has a rating of TVY7, which is lower than the Clone Wars TV PGV. In 2018, Daniel Logan, who played and voiced young Boba Fett in the show, felt that the Clone Wars was taken off the air because it was getting too graphic. Though I'm less inclined to believe that it was the reason the show was cancelled, it's hard to deny that The Clone Wars wasn't pushing its age rating in later seasons. It's possible Disney wanted to moderate what Lucasfilm was getting away with on a TV PGV rating in their new show. And then there's the element of George Lucas. Or I should say, the lack of it. If The Clone Wars continued, Lucas would not have been involved, and that might have not felt right to the entire studio. The Clone Wars was Lucas's story after all. When Lucasfilm Animation said they felt it was the right time to move on from The Clone Wars, that may very well have been the whole truth, as sad as it sounds. Or maybe it wasn't, and that was just their way of making the best of a situation that was chosen for them by Disney. We just don't know. I've always been more of an artist than a businessman, so I have very little tolerance for what happened to The Clone Wars under Disney's ownership. It was a surefire way to cure bad will with one of the most passionate and loyal fan bases almost right from the get-go of the purchase. One could argue that The Clone Wars was part of what made Star Wars the appetizing brand that it was at the time of Lucas's retirement. It helped keep Star Wars from becoming a stagnant IP, so to speak, like Terminator, Back to the Future, even Indiana Jones. If it weren't for The Clone Wars, Rebels would certainly not exist, and would have not been produced at the speed and efficiency of a studio as experienced as Lucasfilm Animation. And perhaps, even if it weren't for The Clone Wars, Lucasfilm wouldn't have Dave Filoni, arguably the most important figure in Star Wars storytelling today. Nevertheless, the spark was out. The Clone Wars was over, save for one final season of bonus content. This is the legacy of Star Wars: The Clone Wars. On March 7th, 2014, a whole year after the last televised episode of the show, Star Wars: The Clone Wars: The Lost Missions released on Netflix along with the entirety of the series. This final season consisted of 13 episodes that were deemed too far along in production to be completely shafted. It was less than what was hoped for, but more than what was expected. If the Clone Wars movie, Season 1 and most of Season 2 show us a galaxy divided in a black and white conflict, and Season 3 through 5 show us the blurring of that conflict, then Season 6 shows us a galaxy entering a point of no return. It's the beginning of the end for the show's many characters and themes, and where exactly they fall in Palpatine's grand chess game. The first of those this season would be the clones. Bred solely for war and invariably for death, we've watched the clones struggle to find meaning in their hopeless existence over the course of several conflicts. There's of course the external conflict of the Republic versus the droid army, but more than that, the clones have faced several internal conflicts as well. Independence versus obedience, Brotherhood versus Banner, and in the opening arc of Season 6, agency versus programming. In another sense, man versus machine. The Jedi and 501st are beleaguered in a never-ending assault over Ringo Vinda, just one of the many never-ending battles that occur near the end of the Clone Wars. In a sudden and shocking move, Tup, the wet behind the ears, promising 501st trooper we saw in Umbara, snaps and kills Jedi Master Tiplar.
Sister!
For the first time in the show, the system that runs the war encounters a glitch, and it rears a disturbing hierarchy of classified cover-ups and secrecy. If you've seen Revenge of the Sith, you may already know where this is going, but because the characters haven't, we're going to rediscover it in agonizing detail from the most heartbreaking perspective possible: Fives. Since Season 1, Fives has been a beacon of independence among the clones. From his defiance to be called by his number in training, to his unwavering dissent with General Krell on Umbara, Fives is fueled by all the things that make him more than just a soldier. There's no question he'd stick his neck out for Tup when he goes to Kamino. Much like the clash between the idealized Republic and true Republic that Ahsoka experiences in Season 5, Fives faces a similar string of realizations between the open and nurturing view of Shaak Ti and the Jedi, to the cold and guarded structure of the Kaminoans. Where Orwellian influences were presented visually in the Season 5 Ahsoka arc, here Katie Lucas presents Orwellian ideas through a conspiracy plot narrative. Fives is fed a deliberate stream of misinformation from the seemingly robotic Kaminoans, trapped in the isolating sterility of their cloning facility. Instead of 2 + 2 = 5, it's good soldiers follow orders. Through Katie Lucas's writing, Kamino has been completely recontextualized into a stark white nightmare. Every revelation Fives encounters leads to more questions than answers, and pursuing those answers involves greater and greater risk. This not only creates more suspense for us as a viewer, but draws us closer and closer to the character of Fives. He's motivated both by the desire to get to the bottom of the brain chip conspiracy, as well as to prove the independence of clones. They're not just products, they're human beings. The characters of AZ3 gives Fives the chance to prove his thesis, and in a surprisingly comical way. Fives convinces AZ to defy their programming and seek out the truth. Their antics provide much needed levity for this arc, and prove what's true of not just the clones, but characters like R2-D2, C-3PO, or even BB-8. They're more than just their programming. In a broader sense, it echoes a theme at the core of the Star Wars saga, that you're more than just your bloodline. But this house of cards is bound to fall, and that's exactly what happens in Orders.
Now, where were we?
Fives is given an audience with Chancellor Palpatine on Coruscant and learns the horrifying truth. Over the next 15 minutes, we watch Fives go through what is probably best described as an existential crisis. This human being who has built their entire existence on the notion that he's not programmed, that he can make choices for himself, that he is unique, has his entire worldview shattered. We're never shown exactly what Palpatine tells Fives, and we can probably infer it, yet watching Fives' peril is all the more captivating, not knowing exactly what he heard. There's an additional layer of ambiguity to Fives' sheer madness. Is this because he was drugged at the start of the episode, or is it really because his chip was removed? Though uncertain, what is certain is that Fives is trapped and alone, manifested in the warehouse conversation with Rex and Anakin. This is probably D. Bradley Baker's best performance moment in the whole series, bringing dimension to Fives' manic suffering. Then, in a final betrayal to everything Fives stands for, Commander Fox kills Fives. Fives' death is easily the most tragic in the entire series. In writing this video, I watched his death back to back with Top's death and noticed something peculiar. It's visually hinted that several clones on some level have had nightmares about Order 66, the mission, as they call it. The fact that it's the last thing Tup and Fives recall before dying, and the bittersweet peace that it brings them recontextualizes Order 66 and the Jedi Purge like never before. Before the Clone Wars, Order 66 felt partially motivated by the Jedi's apathetic treatment of the clones. But here, and throughout the rest of the show, it's plain to see the clones are victims. It makes the fall of the Republic, the death and betrayal of thousands of people, more personal and heartbreaking than ever before. Moving on to the Clovis arc of Season 6, this is the final political arc of the show, and places another crucial puzzle piece in Palpatine's grand takeover of the Republic. The world of Scipio and its banks are evidently inspired by Switzerland, just as the sled chase action sequence feels inspired by On Her Majesty's Secret Service. Clovis was previously characterized as something of a separatist sellout to form a love triangle between Anakin and Padme. But here, Clovis earns a shot at redemption. A man who, from since he was a boy, has been destined to control the banks. He might just be worthy enough for Padme, his old flame. That is, if it wasn't for this guy. Whether it's because of the films, or Lucas's hesitance to revisit it, Anakin and Padme's relationship has always been more of a background feature in the Clone Wars than something to actually be explored. But this political arc doubles as a deconstruction of what really appears to be a very toxic relationship. In the past, Anakin's jealousy was either played for laughs or used for momentary suspense. Though as Anakin has become a more complex character over the course of the show, there are serious ramifications for Anakin's behavior. Anakin is afraid to lose his attachments, and will fight just to keep them. We've seen that, and we see it here in an appropriately brutal way. Deep down, Anakin is still bound to his goodness, capable of seeing his wrongs. However, the reality of what is actually a secretive, distrustful, and unhappy marriage can no longer be ignored. It's an inversion of the last time we saw Anakin, Padme, and Clovis. Instead of rooting for Anakin and Padme, we feel tempted to root against it. At least, I did. Both the collapse of the banking clan and the fate of Anakin Padme's marriage comes full circle by the end. Dooku helps Clovis achieve his destiny, only to bring war to the neutral Scipio and ruin his well-earned redemption. Anakin also rushes to Scipio, not just to save Clovis, but to save Padme to redeem his marriage. And so, in the Clone Wars' latest edition of Death from High Up, Anakin must choose between his redemption or Clovis's, until the choice is made for him.
I'm sorry, Padme.
By the end of the arc, the rockiness of Anakin and Padme's relationship is only momentarily resolved, and Palpatine seizes full control of the Banks. The Clone Wars has practically made a ritual of using the most upstanding people as scapegoats for an unstoppable new order, and that's exactly what happens to Clovis. It furthers the tragedy and the emotional turmoil of the Republic's imminent doom. As for Anakin and Padme, this story lends a perspective both more relatable and meaningful than the unbreakable bond the characters share in the films, and deepens the inner conflict between good and evil raging within Anakin Skywalker. Much needed levity is provided in the two-part Disappeared episodes, where Mace Windu and Jar Jar Binks investigate a cult disappearance on Bardotta. Unlike the other arcs we've discussed, there's not very much depth to these episodes. It's Temple of Doom and Star Wars. Jar Jar gets a love interest. Mace battles Talzin with a flaming sword. All the Bardottans have Indian accents. It turns into a buddy comp adventure with Mace and Jar Jar. The whole thing perfectly captures the feeling of a pulpy Saturday morning cartoon, and that's why it's great. The Clone Wars is never concerned with filling the gap between Episode 2 and 3, so much as it aims to tell any and every story it can, no matter how unexpected. No one could have predicted a story like this to ever be told in Star Wars, but here it is. I think it serves as both a testament to the imagination of Lucas, Filoni, and the writers, as well as just how likable Jar Jar can be. At least a little bit.
Let's get moving.
And last but not least, we're brought to the final arc of the Clone Wars, the Yoda arc. The story begins with Plo Koon investigating a long-lost signal. A piece of lore, if you will, long overlooked by both the fans and the creators of Star Wars, Sifo Dyas. I try not to get too caught up in the lore of Star Wars in these videos. I prefer to focus on the stories being told, how those stories affect the audience. But much like the Order 66 arc that began the season, this arc largely revels in the great mysteries of Star Wars lore and attempts to evoke both our intrigue and imagination from those mysteries. There's also manipulation of Albert Hitchcock's bomb theory that I mentioned in my previous video, except it's how the Jedi uncover the true nature of the Clone Wars and their eventual downfall. It's a startling revelation not just for the Jedi, but also the viewer, who feels a sense of dread for everything the Jedi will go through.
Win the war swiftly, we must, before our enemy's designs reach completion, whatever they may be.
Are you sure we are taking the right path?
The right path? No. The only path? Yes.
But that's just the first episode. The rest of the arc is something of an intergalactic odyssey, and an ambitious attempt to test the character of Yoda. Someone who's always been seen as the wise old sage, the one who's learned every lesson that can be learned. Our faith in Yoda's constancy is what makes his unsettling reaction to hearing Qui-Gon's voice and the journey he embarks on so impactful. What Yoda goes through in these episodes defies the hard-written rules of Force lore. It's neither as vague as an energy that binds all living things, nor as specific as midichlorians. Rather, it's something indescribable and very beautiful. There's a whimsical sense of adventure as Yoda begins his journey, his trust in Anakin to break him out of the temple that exposes Yoda's rare humanity. All the serenity and wonder that accompanies Yoda is visually and very audibly met with an unspeakable, all-consuming evil on Dagobah, on the Force World, on Morband. Throughout the arc, the animators lean heavily into creating abstract environments that breathe, creatures from your worst nightmares, placing Yoda in visually intense scenarios. There are dozens of frames that feel like paintings, all because of the sheer detail poured into them. But perhaps most astonishing to me all these years later is how these episodes put Yoda on a trial at the very core of Lucas's mythology, choosing to be selfless or selfish. The Clone Wars has given the Jedi plenty of reasons to be selfish, to be selective in the suffering of millions. By fighting the war, they've already lost. But in Sacrifice, in one of the show's most captivating sequences, Yoda's given the ultimate choice. This scene opens on a 70-second one-take, grounding Yoda in a scenario where Dooku and Sidious have been spotted on Coruscant, preparing him for the ultimate choice. Anakin kills Dooku, just as he does in Revenge of the Sith, and Yoda fights Sidious, but this is where his choice comes in.
Tempted I will not be. Sacrifice all I am ready to do.
In spite of what Anakin will become, the evil that will consume him, Yoda chooses to save Anakin, to believe in Anakin. An unshakable belief in redemption, the very same belief that guides Luke in Return of the Jedi. Yoda emerges from this trial somehow more wise, more optimistic in the ways of the Force. It's too late to stop the Sith, too far gone in the suffering and loss of the Clone Wars. Yet, as Yoda asserts, there is hope.
No longer certain that one ever does win a war. I am. For in fighting the battles, the bloodshed, already lost we have. Through this path, victory we may yet find. Not victory in the Clone Wars, but victory for all time.
The Clone Wars triumphantly ends on a profoundly hopeful note, the final shot resting on the flower of a tree. A flower that may wither and fall away with the changing times, but will one day bloom into something beautiful. At the time of the show's cancellation and 6th season, there were about 52 unproduced episodes, or 13 4-part arcs, the details of which we've learned over the years from various Star Wars celebrations, Lucasfilm insiders, and Dave Filoni himself. All of these episodes had fully written scripts and were at different stages of production before the show went off the air. There was the Bounty Hunter arc, which saw a team-up between Boba Fett and Cad Bane, would have shown us how Fett got the dent in his helmet, and would have wrapped up the arcs of both characters in the show. The Crystal Crisis on Utapau arc, which shows Anakin and Obi-Wan hunting down a giant crystal that presumably powers the Death Star, Ahsoka's Walkabout, which would have shown what happened to Ahsoka after leaving the Jedi Order, the Bad Batch arc, which saw Rex teaming up with a squad of defective clones with desirable traits as they rescue ARC Trooper Echo, the Dark Disciple arc, a sprawling 8-part arc that follows Quinlan Vos as he teams up with Asajj Ventress to assassinate Count Dooku, an arc on Kashyyyk, which would have seen the return of the Bad Batch, as well as explore why Yoda had such good relations with the Wookiees in Episode 3, the Son of Dathomir arc, which would have shown what happened to Maul after Season 5, a war between the Shadow Collective and the Sith, and would have both recontextualized and resolved Mother Talzin's arc in the show, a Top Gun-inspired clone and droid arc, which would have ended with Rex and R2 stranded on a planet together, and in quote-unquote, a very dark place, an arc that would have seen the arrival of the Yuuzhan Vong, except they wouldn't be voids in the Force like in the expanded universe, an arc where Yoda discovers a Sith shrine underneath the Jedi Temple that would have ended with Ahsoka trying to stop Darth Sidious from breaking into the Holocron Vault, a Return to Mon Cala arc with Padme, where you would have seen more of the Corran civilization as opposed to the Mon Calamari, and finally, the Siege of Mandalore, which would have concluded the arcs of Rex, Maul, and Ahsoka, as well as show us what happens to them during Revenge of the Sith. If produced and released as intended, the Clone Wars would have gone on to be an 8-season show. So close, yet so far. Shortly after Season 6, Lucasfilm launched the Clone Wars Legacy Project, an effort to convert some of the unproduced arcs into consumable media. The first of these was Son of Dathomir, adapted as a 4-issue comic book. Though I'm not a huge fan of the artwork, nor just how many visuals from the actual arc were excluded for the adaptation, the story is incredibly interesting and further fleshes out the characters of not just Maul and Talzin, but also Palpatine, a rare thing in the show. Dark Disciple was turned into a full-blown novel by Christie Golden, based off of the scripts of Kitty Lucas. It's a fascinating story filled with twists and juicy character drama. The intimacy of both Vos and Ventress and their internal turmoil is explored in fascinating depth, and the conclusion of Ventress' storyline, from a heartless assassin to a selfless lover, would have been a tear-jerking event to see unfold on screen. Then, in September 2014, Stars.com released the unproduced, fully voiced story reels for the Crystal Crisis arc. If you've never watched it, let me just say that this arc is freaking awesome. Aside from further exploring the dynamic between Anakin and Obi-Wan, as well as Anakin's feelings about Ahsoka leaving the Jedi Order, this might be the funniest arc in the entire series. There's loads of hilarious banter between Anakin and Obi-Wan as these characters find themselves in a never-ending string of unexpected situations. It also has two of the best Anakin never met Grievous moments in the show. Last but not least, Stars.com also released the unproduced fully voiced story reels for the Bad Batch arc in 2015 after showing them at Star Wars Celebration. I'll save most of my thoughts on this for later, but at the time, it was an extremely fun story and a reminder of the classic Clone Wars storytelling people first fell in love with on the show. As for every other unproduced arc or episode, all that remained were the snippets of information from Filoni and Lucasfilm, and brief clips and reels shown at Star Wars Celebration. For years, that's all anyone had left of the Clone Wars. Following the show's cancellation, fans organized both on social media and in person at events like Star Wars Celebration and Comic-Con in an effort to convince Disney and Lucasfilm to revive the show. The most popular social media movement was #SaveTheCloneWars, actively pushing for more of the show's content to be released or for the show's revival. From an outside view, it was difficult to tell whether or not the movement had any impact, or if Disney would ever grant fans their wishes. Nevertheless, fans of the Clone Wars persisted, day after day. As for Disney, the corporate takeover of Star Wars took the brand in a promising but limited direction for some fans and creators. Every book, comic, game, and piece of media was suddenly and seemingly obsessed with the original trilogy, what Star Wars was before Lucas made the prequels and challenged people's conceptions about Star Wars, before he ruined their childhoods. Even the Star Wars films made under Disney have been deliberately preoccupied with recycling and referencing moments from the original films, a criticism I actually levied against the first season of the Clone Wars. It's almost as if Disney's distinctively square view of the brand encouraged the idea that Star Wars was just black and white, rebels and stormtroopers, X-Wings and TIE fighters, light and dark, and never anything more. I never put much thought into it, but in retrospect, the problem is pretty obvious. Star Wars is more than that. The prequels, and especially the Clone Wars, were more than that. Instead, everyone was witnessing for the first time Star Wars without its visionary.
They looked at the stories and they said, we want to make something for the fans. So I said, all I wanted to do was tell a story of what happened. You know, it started here and it went there. And it's all about generations, and it's about, you know, the issues of fathers and sons and grandfathers, and it's a family soap opera. They wanted to do a retro movie. I don't like that. Every movie I worked very hard to make them different. I make them completely different with, you know, different planets, with different spaceships, with different, you know, to make it new.
So are you at peace with this?
Yeah.
As much as you can be?
Yeah. No, I said, look, I'm fine.
Though that should have stopped many creators from pushing Lucas's mythology forward into interesting directions, it didn't stop Dave Filoni. Though Star Wars Rebels was not a widely beloved show in its first season, it opened the door to recontextualizing a new chapter in the Star Wars universe in very much the same way the Clone Wars did for the prequels. Even still, most people weren't very open to the show and were very reluctant to give it a chance. That is, until the Season 1 finale, when none other than Ahsoka Tano came down the ladder of the Ghost and made her long-awaited return to the Star Wars universe.
Ahsoka. My name is Ahsoka Tano.
Shortly after reintroducing Ahsoka, a much-aged Rex, Wolf, and Gregor appeared on the show, later followed by Hondo, Maul, battle droids, Bo-Katan, and several other references to the Clone Wars. What many fans once viewed as an unwanted follow-up to a superior show became the lifeline for characters they grew up with or came to love. And more than that, Filoni was utilizing every lesson Lucas taught him about storytelling to enhance Rebels, to make the most of a story that was initially forced upon him, before he took it and made it his own. Because of the Clone Wars, and through Rebels, Filoni inherited Lucas's Star Wars mythology. And yet, it's unclear if that mythology has been preserved in the current era of Star Wars films. It's one thing to not have Lucas behind the wheel of a Star Wars movie, but it's another thing to have no visionary at all. No burning desire to tell a meaningful story, just the instinct to leave everything exactly as Lucas left it. Or worse yet, to misunderstand the point of Lucas's storytelling, to contradict the core of his mythology in the worst way possible. When you take a big step back, Star Wars is just about space wizards and lasers, sure, but it can and has been so much more than that. It's a story that changed people's lives, gripped them with the story of a son and his father. And not that these new films haven't achieved similar feats, but they all seem to disagree about what Star Wars is. It's no wonder the fanbase is as divided as it is, unable to have a conversation about anything in the mythology, when the current creators aren't even sure what Star Wars is either. There have been several creators who do get that mythology and have told meaningful stories with it, but the damage of Disney's corporate vision hasn't given these stories the audiences they deserve, and that's truly heartbreaking. With every passing month, every article or rumor that yet another director was fired from a Star Wars movie, the identity of the mythology was becoming more and more fractured, replaced by a conveyor belt of spiritually bankrupt products. Eventually, it was time to move on. As Clone Wars drifted from memory, I largely forgot what I loved about Star Wars and put it all behind me. Until it happened. On July 19th, 2018, Dave Filoni, along with line producer Athena Portillo, Ashley Eckstein, Matt Lancer, and Kevin Kiner, held a panel at Comic-Con to celebrate the 10th anniversary of the Clone Wars. There were rumors that the return of the show would be announced at the panel, but for the most part, it was nothing beyond speculation, and nothing that got me out of bed in the morning. But then, It happened. As the panel drew to a close, Filoni thanked the fans for their loyalty to the Clone Wars and gave them a surprise they'd never forget.
And I think we got together. And we thought if there's one thing we could give you, what would it be? So here you go.
On July 19th, 2018, The Clone Wars was saved. Against all odds, doubts, and unlikelihoods, Star Wars The Clone Wars was set to return for a final 12-episode season on Disney+. When I tell you I was shocked to see the show return, that I was in almost complete disbelief, it really couldn't do my full feelings justice, nor the feelings of many fans. Animated or not, it's rare for any show to come back from the dead, even if it is Star Wars. For many, the return of the Clone Wars was the return of our childhood, and in a much broader sense, the return of the Clone Wars was the final hurrah of Lucas's storytelling. From the very announcement of the show's return, Filoni made it clear to fans how important it was for his studio to be working again on the Clone Wars. Not just as an opportunity to revisit the story that gave their studio its start, but as a way to give the series the big finish it's always deserved. To accomplish this, Dave Filoni, now supervising director and executive producer, reassembled his team for the Clone Wars, much of whom worked with him on Rebels. Killian Plunkett returned as art director, Joel Aaron as director of cinematography and lighting, Keith Kellogg as animation director, Matthew Wood and David Accord as sound engineers, and Kevin Kiner as the composer. Where Filoni and his team of creators once stumbled as apprentices to Lucas, now they were the masters. Additionally, Nate Comier, Jason Tucker's assistant editor during the late seasons of the Clone Wars, became the supervising editor for all of Season 7, visual effects veteran Gianni Aliati assumed the role of lighting and effects supervisor, and animation storyboard artist Nathaniel Villanueva and Lucasfilm animator Saul Ruiz tag-teamed the episodic direction of the latter two arcs of the season. As I mentioned earlier, there are about 52 unfinished episodes at the time of the show's cancellation, but this final season would only have 12. Bearing in mind the high budget of the art style, it's possible Disney wouldn't allow Filoni any more than 12 episodes, roughly half a season for half the overall cost. It's also possible that the backdoor purpose for this final season was to test the viability of a future yet-to-be-announced weekly animated series on Disney+. On the other hand, perhaps Filoni was only interested in telling these 12 episodes. He's moved on to what he feels are bigger and better things, and would rather not be tied to his past. And heck, perhaps Filoni elected only to finish 12 episodes because without Lucas, it wouldn't be right to work on the Clone Wars. Once again, we just don't know the full reasoning. What we do know is why Filoni chose the 3 story arcs he did. The first arc centers on the development of Rex and the clones. The second arc centers on the development of Ahsoka and her view of the Jedi. The third arc merges the story threads of Rex, Ahsoka, and several of the show's other characters and themes into a series finale. To Filoni personally, The Clone Wars has largely been about Rex and Ahsoka, 2 characters who became rocks for the audience to latch onto in the turbulent years of the Clone Wars. With all that being said, Dave Filoni, Lucasfilm Animation, and their partner studio CGCG picked up the pieces where they left off and embarked on the final season of Star Wars: The Clone Wars. Since this is the final season, we're going to go more in depth than what we usually do. On February 21st, 2020, Season 7 premiered with the Bad Batch arc, originally released as story reels 5 years earlier. We pick up with Anakin Skywalker and the 501st on the besieged world of Anaxis, as they've been locked in an endless battle with the separatist forces of Admiral Trench. Tom Kane's opening narration is a bit different, incorporating more flash fade cuts that correspond with characters and moments in the narration. Though it initially threw me off, I have to admit it's a fun improvement over the original editing style of the narration, and better emulates the classic war dramas the opening narration was inspired by. Kevin Kiner's music is more dynamic and responsive to the action and editing than ever before, elevating the John Wick-inspired one-takes laden throughout the arc. Almost everyone in the episode receives an updated character model. Anakin has his Revenge of the Sith hair, the Jedi have their Revenge of the Sith robes, and the clones look slightly more like Tamara Morrison. Though the original art style of the show remains intact in the final season, there is a noticeable tiptoe away from the stylized character design in favor of photorealistic design. As I said, it's merely a tiptoe, there's barely a difference. But on the whole, many characters look more like the actor they're based on, akin to how Maul was designed in the show's 4th season. Regardless of how you feel about this shift, they do give this season a feeling of freshness, and better match the overall improvement in the show's visual fidelity. Painted textures in not just this episode, but the entire season, are somehow more intricately detailed than they've ever been. The shot of the Commander Droid in particular made me gawk. It's so much better than the original Commander Droid model. Aaron, Kellogg, and Aliati effortlessly bring the show to life like never before through the super aggressive use of lighting and effects. There's so many visually distinct scenarios throughout the season, starting with this episode. Using lenses developed during the production of Rebels, Aaron applies a new cinematic quality to the Clone Wars. There's a heavy emphasis on depth of field and deeper colors in just about every shot. Unbelievably, the Clone Wars Season 7 finally achieves what feels like feature-quality animation, a sheer impossibility for Lucasfilm back in 2008, and a distant hope in the show's late season. In spite of how long it's been since the Clone Wars was on the air, the Bad Batch arc feels like the Clone Wars never really stopped. D. Bradley Baker is back to doing what he does best, talking to himself for minutes on end, even as the villain. The Bad Batch are a fun and meaningful iteration on the individuality of clones, so unique in their ways that even the normal clones have trouble dealing with them. Baker injects each member with a playful personality, especially Tech and Wrecker.
Is it over already? Oh, man!
However, one of Baker's subtler accomplishments in this arc is the sense of newfound vulnerability he gives to Rex. The never-ending brutality of clones throughout the show is very evidently taking a toll on him, a symbol of the perfect soldier starting to wear at the seams. If even the slightest possibility emerges that one of his brothers in arms may be alive, then there's practically nothing Rex wouldn't be willing to do to save them. That's what makes Rex a compelling character in this arc. There's a raw desperation to him that wasn't there before. A sense of passion and humanity that's largely informed by his dynamic with Anakin Skywalker. In fact, Anakin has entrusted Rex with so much of himself, he bestows him the awkward responsibility of lookout when he talks to Padme. Where we previously examined the toxic element of Anakin and Padme's relationship, the pendulum swings in the opposite direction here. Padme is the voice of reason, the light in Anakin's darkness. She inspires much of Anakin's humanity, and represents the soul of the Republic he's sworn to protect. It's an amazing final scene for a character Catherine Tabor devoted so much time bringing new life to in the show. In turn, Obi-Wan, who Anakin is increasingly hesitant to entrust with his true feelings, demonstrates emotional awareness and maturity that supersedes just about everyone involved.
I hope you at least told Padme I said hello.
All of these characters are more interconnected than ever, elevating each other's strengths, but also bringing out more of their flaws in doing so. It's just one of the many interesting character dynamics circulating through the Bad Batch arc, a story that's ultimately about how people are connected, and the consideration of trust and acceptance that comes with that. The mission Anakin, Rex, and the Bad Batch go on is thrilling and adventurous, but meaningful in that they largely succeed by learning to work past their differences, even with the Poltex. The revolving door of Separatist villains in this arc lose because they don't communicate, they don't work past their discrepancies, they simply let the problem fall on the next person. That's why the Bad Batch arc feels so in line with classic Clone Wars storytelling. The actions of the characters prove a thematic message that anyone can learn from. As for the show's ongoing portrayal of the clones, Brent Friedman and Matt Niknovitz offer an optimistic conclusion to the tragedy of Domino Squad. The clones of the Clone Wars have suffered too much, been through too much to be nothing more than the stepping stones for a grand cause. A soldier deserves more than that, like Cut LaQuaine, the deserter. The Call of Duty binds these clones to war, there's no question of that. But in a rare moment, by conflict's end, as Echo has gone from the soldier who repeated every order to the man quite literally feeding orders to the enemy's demise, Echo gets the chance to choose his own path and join the Bad Batch. The final patriotic salute between Rex and these characters signifies a unilateral acceptance of what it means to be a warrior. Loss may be part of the job, but the real victory is having the chance to serve, to do the right thing. And if nothing else, Echo's decision only foreshadows Rex's not-so-distant future. The second arc of the season picks up with Ahsoka's Walkabout, originally written by Charles Murray, the author of the legendary Season 5 Ahsoka arc. I had high hopes for this story, considering how different of an adventure it would be for Ahsoka, someone who became even more interesting by her bravery to leave the Jedi Order. We've well explored the moral quandary of the Jedi from within the war, but not so much outside of it. Murray dabbled in that perspective in Season 5, but here it becomes the focus. Unfortunately, the story Murray and Filoni elected to tell over these 4 episodes left many fans scratching their heads, and for a couple of reasons. Ahsoka's walkabout begins when she crash lands on the platform of Trace Martez, a wet behind-the-ears mechanic who dreams of being a hotshot pilot. Ahsoka then meets Trace's sister, Rafa, who's far more cynical and less idealistic than Trace. The dynamic of the sisters is interesting, and manifests into the subtle manipulation Rafa exerts over her sister. Yes, I'm trying to say these are mostly well-written characters, despite the claims of the social media echo chamber. The true faults of this arc are a bit more complicated and worth discussing. It's probably valuable to know that these 4 episodes were originally written with a completely different single character in place of the 2 Martez sisters, a wannabe Han Solo named Nix Okami, and the first Asian lead in the show. Even the original animatics for this arc feature duplicate scenes with Nix in place of Trace or Rafa. It's kind of funny. Outside of occupying the character traits and dialogue exchanges split between the 2 sisters, Nix would have served as a tentative love interest for Ahsoka. We don't know how deep that romance would have gone, but it most certainly altered the tone of the story compared to the final version of the arc. So why did Nix get nixed? I strongly believe the decision to replace Nix with the Martez sisters comes from a place of good intentions, and a measured decision by Filoni to better serve Ahsoka's character. These 4 episodes are ultimately about choosing your path. Ahsoka is at a genuine crossroad for the first time in her life. The Jedi teachings and the lessons of her master are all she's ever known. In many ways, she's forever tied to those teachings, forever tied to her upbringing, a truth beautifully conveyed in her 4th connection with Anakin as she leaves Coruscant.
Should I send a detachment, General?
No, it's nothing.
At the same time, her newfound freedom presents an opportunity to find a completely new pursuit: money, fame, or adventure. This crossroad is perfectly captured in a moment where Ahsoka walks out on the platform of 1313, gazing out at the starships as they rise and fall before her. It very directly parallels the iconic Twin Suns moment of the original Star Wars, where Luke considers his life on the ranch and a life of adventure. It's an amazing parallel recontextualized in the industrial sea of Coruscant nobodies. Filoni further capitalizes on this choice by introducing Trace and Rafa. Trace is terribly similar to 2008 Ahsoka, innocent, starry-eyed, but fallible. Rafa is a potential future Ahsoka, more secure in her beliefs, but less compassionate overall. These characters are the yin and yang of Ahsoka, showing her 2 distinct paths and points of view within her. The challenge Ahsoka faces on her walkabout is learning to balance these sisters out and form her own perspective. The Jedi have arguably done more harm than good in the war, completely detached from the everyday reality of the people in Coruscant. But that doesn't mean the Jedi aren't capable of good, aren't capable of doing the right thing. Ahsoka may not be a Jedi, but deep down, she's been raised to be a good person, and chooses to walk the path that lets her help others in need. It's yet another powerful lesson for the viewer, and one that's achieved because of the circumstances beset by Trace and Rafa. Perhaps a romantic storyline would have helped to inform the path Ahsoka chooses as well, but likely at the cost of diluting the focus of the storytelling. Crossroads tend to get more complicated when love enters the equation, just look at Anakin. And besides, Ahsoka has already had the experience of a fling on the show. In the end, removing Nix was a productive change. So why doesn't it feel that way? Well, it really comes down to 2 things: plot and presentation. The Clone Wars has always been good at crafting interesting plots. Episodes such as the Season 4 Bounty Hunter arc become gauntlets for the characters, putting them in vulnerable situations that show us more about the characters than we've ever seen before. These episodes also take on the context of the greater plot of the series, whether it's the advancement of the war or the machinations of Palpatine. In this regard, the plot of Ahsoka's walkabout is one of the few times the show stumbles, and unfortunately, it's in the central third of the final season. The sisters make the costly mistake of transporting spice to the Pike Syndicate. Trace decides to dump the spice to avoid getting it to the Pikes. They all get captured, break out, get captured again. Ahsoka cracks a deal to secure the sisters' freedom. The sisters come back for her. Everyone gets out alive. Aside from the simple description, spice deal gone wrong, several beats of the plot feel repetitive, especially in Dangerous Debt. However, that shouldn't necessarily dictate that the plot can't be presented in a personal or interesting way, right? Except the reason it isn't arises in the moments that the plot progresses. As I've mentioned, the arc took on a different tone when it removed Nyx Okami. We don't know if it would have played out quite the same way, but there was another layer of personal circumstances for Ahsoka beyond keeping her Jedi past a secret. Nyx likely had more dialogue than either of the two sisters, and probably played both of their actions. Through several dialogue exchanges, it's hard not to detect a sense of awkwardness in how characters move from one beat to the next. The worst offender of this might be the spice dumping scene. Though Trace's decision to dump the spice derives from her idealistic point of view, it's a frustratingly uninformed decision. Having Ahsoka call her out on it doesn't make the moment more forgivable either. Unfortunately, Trace never really gets the chance to completely redeem herself for that moment, even though both the sisters learned their lesson in the last episode. It's entirely possible that the context of this beat was very different and more understandable with Nyx, and I'm inclined to think it was, as the whole plot was constructed with just this character in mind, not the two sisters. I'm surprised Filoni didn't take more care into rewriting these episodes. It might have been better to tell a completely different story altogether. Regardless, this arc is still filled with several well-directed moments, and strengthens the character of Ahsoka going into her final trial of the Clone Wars, the Siege of Mandalore. Because this is the final arc of the show, we're going to view it as the culmination of every lesson Filoni and Lucasfilm Animation have learned as a studio. No pressure, of course.
Now, Sam mentioned earlier something about the Siege of Mandalore.
Yeah.
Anything you can tell us?
It's a big deal. It's the story I've thought most about probably over the last decade. And how does that all work?
The final 4 episodes of Star Wars The Clone Wars were written by Dave Filoni and co-directed by Nathaniel Villanueva and Saul Ruiz. Even removed from the hype, these are easily some of the best written, directed, edited, scored, and acted episodes in the series, and one of the most creatively ambitious stories in all of Star Wars. An exhaustive amount of thought was put into these episodes, and I intend to highlight that thought at every opportunity I can. Each episode opens with the classic 80s Lucasfilm logo, and the first episode with John Williams' Star Wars theme. Both of these touches give the story a sense of permanence and timelessness in the continuity of Star Wars. Each episode serves as what many working on the show have described as part of a larger overall film, almost like a complete evolution of the 2008 Clone Wars movie. As hated as that film is, this film never shies away from acknowledging its history, even mirroring the Battle of Christophsis and the Battle of Urbana the film opens with. All the main characters get appropriately heroic introductions, and Anakin even gets a moment reflective of Luke's stand against the First Order in The Last Jedi. Star Wars, and by extension the Clone Wars, is filled with parallels, and many of those parallels show connections between generations or offer a capsule through time. The battle climaxes on a moment reminiscent of the Return of the Jedi sail barge fight, a bold celebration of the heroism of the Skywalker family. From here, Anakin and Obi-Wan reunite with Ahsoka for the first time in forever. Everything about the reunion of Anakin and Ahsoka is handled very carefully. The moment of Ahsoka walking off the shuttle is a very direct parallel to when she first walked off the shuttle in the Clone Wars movie. Much has changed since then. There's a tragic incongruity in how Anakin and Ahsoka view each other. Both perceive each other with the same feeling of constancy they held when they were master and apprentice. The reality is that the two have changed significantly, especially Ahsoka, and the awkwardness of that plays out appropriately. Filoni could have easily turned the reunion into a crowd-pleasing moment, but he traded that for a more sincere approach. Painting the 5 first helmets with Ahsoka's markings is a touching way to demonstrate the ripple effect Ahsoka's actions have had. It's more than you could ever ask for in the character. And though Anakin returning Ahsoka's lightsabers to her with blue blades fiddles with continuity, the lightsabers become a physical manifestation of the relationship. Anakin never stopped thinking about Ahsoka, never stopped thinking of ways to help her. That, and all of his teachings, go with her to Mandalore. However, what I'm most fascinated about in the reunion is how often Ruiz uses shot-reverse shot to have the character say nothing. Functionally, shot-reverse shot is used to exchange dialogue, it's used all the time. But rather than locking the meaning of their exchange into chosen words, saying nothing ironically says far more. It's a far cry from the overly talkative Clone Wars movie, and it capitalizes on the maturity of Anakin and Ahsoka's dynamic. No longer are they master and apprentice, they're more than that. The final exchange between these characters mirrors the last time they parted ways at the Jedi Temple on bittersweet terms. Except, in spite of the duty that splits these characters once again, it feels like they've finally accepted their separation. The look on Anakin's face is that of a proud older brother. Ahsoka's all grown up, and has applied every lesson he's ever taught her to do the right thing. And in a more down-to-earth way, it's a look of gratitude, a thank you for being one of the best things to ever happen to him. I spoke a great deal in my previous video about how Mandalore is portrayed in the show. It's a utopia that becomes a battleground, undone by violence and war. Mandalore foreshadows the fall of the Republic, but for the same reason, it also foreshadows its eventual redemption. The Republic may be ripe to be overthrown by Palpatine, too far gone to be redeemed. But together, Ahsoka and Bo-Katan can save Mandalore, almost like a proto-rebel alliance. That's what makes this such a final perfect battle for the show. From there, the Siege of Mandalore sets off like a bolt of lightning. Ruiz effortlessly flows between action, humor, and suspense through the whole landing sequence. Every shot is cut at the right moment, and the sounds of explosions, punches, and saber swings are super satisfying. Kevin Kiner goes full Williams by emulating the Battle over Coruscant. The stakes immediately escalate once our heroes are on the surface, as Gar Saxon and his Mandalorians slaughter countless Republic forces. Nobody knows where Maul is, and the longer the siege ensues, the more troubling that becomes. As we quickly realize, Maul has planned a trap for the Jedi in the sewers, but for someone else entirely. Just as Anakin and Obi-Wan received heroic introductions several scenes before, Maul is given his own villainous introduction, rearing with him more presence than any Clone Wars villain has ever had.
I was hoping for Kenobi. Why are you here?
What ensues over the next 20 minutes is an exercise in anxiety. Maul isn't here to kill Ahsoka, and he's hesitant to state the true nature of his plans. Whatever dread occupies his thoughts becomes this unimaginable, unquantifiable thing, and that's effectively brought to life through the raw edge of Sam Witwer's performance. It sets the tone of the episode and transforms the Siege of Mandalore into a far more ambiguous conflict. Kiner elaborates on this eeriness with a heavily electronic score, droning synths, and a persistent beating percussion, almost like the ticking of a clock. Our heroes are rapidly approaching the unknown, racing to find out what Maul has planned. And when they do, when Ahsoka finds out, it's pretty mind-blowing. In our previous video, we dissected both Maul and Ahsoka in great detail. Maul is driven by fear along a perpetual cycle of victimization and revenge. He's stuck, and it's largely because he refuses to grow as a person. Ahsoka is virtually the complete opposite. She's in a constant state of growing and absorbing lessons throughout the show. By applying what she's learned in pursuit of the right thing, she becomes a fearless character. When these two forces of nature face each other, they are compelled by completely opposing things. And yet, they have more in common than one would think. Maul and Ahsoka are outsiders, discarded by a cause they once swore loyalty to, beset upon an entirely new path. Though Maul's path is selfish, and Ahsoka's path is selfless, a moment of narrative brilliance almost unites the goals of these characters. Maul wants to kill Anakin before he can become Sidious's apprentice, and use Ahsoka to help him kill Sidious. Though Maul would save the galaxy in doing so, he's still motivated by revenge, and it would inevitably replace Sidious. For Ahsoka, this is an opportunity to save more lives, but at the cost of giving up on Anakin. It's a fascinating turn of character for Maul, and a subversion of the join me scene we've seen in every Star Wars film. The Clone Wars humanizes the dark side on several occasions, especially with Ventress, but I never expected Maul to follow similar footsteps. Maul is cursed to fail again and again in everything he does, and yet, he still tries to make his tragic existence more meaningful. The clash between Maul and Ahsoka is a fitting embodiment of the audience's perception of Anakin. Like Maul, we already know what Anakin will become, but like Ahsoka, who's seen the heroic, good-natured Anakin on several occasions, we never want to stop believing otherwise. The duel between Maul and Ahsoka is easily the best in the show for three key reasons. The mocap of Ray Park and Laurie Mary Kim contributes a sense of realism and danger hardly felt in some of the show's best fights. Kiner's music is neither triumphant nor trepidatious, just the vigorous pounding of drums to complement the complicated circumstances of the fight. And because of those circumstances, the fact that they're fighting because they failed to come to an agreement makes this one of the most emotionally complex duels in all of Star Wars. Both characters are right, but only one is driven by the right thing, the selfless thing. As the fight ends and Ahsoka catches Maul with the Force, he viciously pleads for his death. a deeply troubling remark from a character who was infamously too stubborn to die.
You're all going to burn! We're all going to die! You don't know what you're doing!
Kiner's electronic score drones louder and louder into Part 3. Mandalore should feel like a victory, but no one is permitted to feel so. All of our heroes are left to reflect on the ambiguity of the war and the contradiction their role as warriors embodies. Bo-Katan wishes she was good at something other than fighting and attests her lack of understanding for her sister's idealism. Ahsoka was raised to be a peacekeeper, but has only ever been a warrior since she was a Padawan. Rex acknowledges the war should have never happened, but none of the clones would exist without it. For a franchise called Star Wars, the times in which characters reflect on the effects of war are few and far in between. The Clone Wars has shown several different sides of the war, giving us perspective on all who are affected by it. But war in itself, the process of fighting it, is tragic, and in many cases, unnecessary. That sentiment becomes the focus of the film's second half, as Filoni uses the plot points of Revenge of the Sith as a springboard to elaborate on those ideas. Ahsoka's vision replays the moment of Mace's death in Revenge of the Sith, and Matt Lanter's voice can partially be heard, a clever way to connect the two Anakins together. With no real time for the audience to prepare, Sidious utters the dreadful words,
"Execute Order 66.
Stay back!
Find him. Find him. Vibes.
Find him!
The editing during the clones' initial attack is fast and chaotic. Kiner practically blasts Anakin's dark deeds over the scene, almost as to give Ahsoka yet another thing to defend herself against. Her mission has changed. She must find the truth of what's happening. Off of Rex's fleeting suggestion, the conspiracy uncovered by Fives finally grounds itself in Order 66 in a surprisingly chilling way. Fives didn't die for nothing. Because we are viewing this arc as a culmination of several of the show's themes and arcs, I'd like to think Ahsoka's droid squad is the culmination of every eye-rolling droid episode we've had in the series. There's a reason droids matter so much in Star Wars. In spite of being programmed, there's an endearing innocence to droids, like man's best friend. Without them, Ahsoka wouldn't have been able to save Rex. So you better show D-Squad more respect, folks. Ruiz's direction in Part 3 is phenomenal, but I wouldn't hesitate to say Part 4 is the best directed episode in the series. Villanueva kicks things off at 80 miles per hour, but by the end they're practically at 200. Where Obi-Wan or Yoda could easily escape their circumstances in Revenge of the Sith, the Venator cruiser completely traps all of our characters. Maul wreaks unimaginable havoc, while Ahsoka and Rex do everything in their power to prevent further chaos. We know clones better than we ever will, we know what they've been through and how undeserved their forced servitude to Sidious is. The obsession with the moral dilemma of taking a life versus sparing a life, smattered through dozens of movies and shows over the last decade, very rarely provides a compelling emotional argument for why characters shouldn't kill. It's for that reason I have to tip my hat to Filoni, who I think succeeds in delivering that emotional argument here. Ahsoka knows more than any Jedi about the victimhood of clones, and how much they deserve to have their freedom. Everything Rex has been through has instilled him with a stronger and stronger loyalty to his brothers, and so the last thing he truly wants to do is kill them. Showing Rex's tears as Ahsoka pulls away his helmet conveys how fundamentally important that is to Rex. Brotherhood is his life. We're so emotionally invested in both these characters that there's no question we wouldn't do the same thing too. It's the right moral dilemma for the series finale, and underlines the battle of selfishness versus selflessness at the heart of Star Wars. Much of what remains in Part 4 is a heart-pounding set piece. With every small victory our heroes gain comes an increasingly greater problem to deal with. Kiner is striking drums, blaring trumpets, louder and louder with each passing second. We spent a lot of time on Venators in the show. They've become something of an environment of stability, a home for our heroes, and a symbol of their fight. But the annihilation of the Venator slowly rips away that stability, and destroys just about every quality we've confided in it as a viewer. Every character moment, no matter how small, results from increasingly difficult choices. But because of who Rex and Ahsoka are, the experiences they've had, and the lessons they've learned, they make the right choices and make it out alive. The debris chase is probably one of the most impressive animated sequences in the show, and probably the coolest thing Ahsoka has ever done. Kiner's music reaches a quieter resolve, and every technical aspect of this madness that surrounds our heroes fades away. I I've read a good number of interpretations on the show's ending, and I think almost all of them are supported. It's for that reason that I think the final 2 scenes of Part 4 are a perfect reflection of the Clone Wars. The Republic the Venator has come to symbolize is forever ruined, merged with a desolate wasteland. All the expectant, vibrant colors of the show's art style are washed out, and Kyner's synths drone more quietly and solemnly than ever before, occasionally swelling to overwhelming waves of emotion. Even Ahsoka's leitmotif is buried in the droning, never completely playing out the theme, representing the toll this moment has taken on her identity. Almost every frame is consumed by a matte painting, giving these final 2 scenes a sense of permanence and astounding beauty. Until now, clones have never been so much as privileged with a burial, not even once in the Star Wars canon. So seeing Ahsoka stand before the burial ground of the clones ensnares more pain, more tragedy, more heartache than maybe any other visual in the show. At the forefront of the burial site lies Jesse, the Republic symbol on his helmet smudged by dirt and blood. These clones, the proud, valiant soldiers of the Republic, are destined to be forgotten, but not by Ahsoka nor Rex. Ahsoka takes one final look at her lightsaber, her life, the weapon of the Jedi, a weapon of war and fear, a physical connection to all of her trauma, but also her connection to Anakin. And then she lets it go. Ahsoka completes her character arc and comes to terms with who she is. A survivor, an idealist, a Jedi, sure, but for the first time ever, Ahsoka knows what it means to be a peacekeeper, just as Luke discovered for himself in Return of the Jedi. Whatever connection she holds to those she cares about will live on within her, and all that the Clone Wars meant to her will fade into memory. A numbing whiteness ensues as monochromatic colors consume the screen. The themes buried in Kyner's droning synths are so distorted they're practically unrecognizable. Darth Vader, a walking void in the wasteland, approaches the wreckage of the Venator. He finds Ahsoka's lightsaber and curiously turns it on. Vader says nothing, merely looking up at the blue blade of a weapon he once held onto so strongly in the hopes he could give it back to his one-time apprentice. Vader holds the saber at his side, embodying the heroic pose of General Skywalker from the Clone Wars. Maybe that hero's deep down inside him, but too much has changed to really be sure. Thematically, this visual perfectly captures the blurring of good and evil the Clone Wars represents. Fiction's most heartless villain holding a symbol of compassion. Altogether, we don't know if Vader takes this moment as a sign of Ahsoka's death, or if the gift he once gave her was completely abandoned, but we do see Vader walk away with it. If there's one thing Anakin and Vader have in common, it's that they take their attachments with them wherever they go. The way of the dark side is to never move on, and one can only imagine the waking hell Vader experiences for his long-gone apprentice. It's perhaps the most relatable Vader moment I can say I've ever experienced. As Vader turns his back on the crash sites, the camera rests on the disfigured clone helmet with Ahsoka's markings. This final shot completely fulfills the purpose of the Clone Wars. A footnote in the legend of Anakin Skywalker. A tale of victory and death, tragedy long forgotten, the memory and times of Ahsoka Tano inseparable from the brave men destined to be buried by time. The greatest tragedy the galaxy will never know. After one theatrical film, 133 episodes, and 15 years of production, George Lucas, Dave Filoni, and the cast and crew of Lucasfilm Animation finally completed Star Wars: The Clone Wars, one of the most ambitious 3D animated series ever made, and one of the greatest animated shows of all time. Though there are still some 40 episodes that have yet to be produced, the show was most likely done for good, especially if Filoni's words are to be believed. There's hope that the stories told throughout those remaining 10 arcs will eventually find their way into a different medium, whether as a comic, book, or audio drama, but for now, I'm grateful for the arcs that we did get to see in the final season. The series does feel pretty complete now, and as a longtime fan of the show, that's not a feeling I thought I'd ever have. With the show finally complete, we're left to reflect on the meaning of Lucas's final story. Finding family, pursuing selflessness, confronting fear, giving hope. These are all ingredients of every Star Wars story, and they're most definitely present in the Clone Wars. However, what makes the Clone Wars stand out from the rest of Lucas's storytelling is its dedication to offering a new perspective. The battle of good and evil has always been told from within the Skywalker family, while the forces at work in the larger galaxy serve as an extension of that battle. But what often gets lost in this point of view are all the people affected by that conflict. How war affects a galaxy, people's identities, their sense of right and wrong, and the circumstances beset upon them. Right from the introduction of Ahsoka, Anakin's never-mentioned Padawan, the Clone Wars has challenged our perception of Star Wars. That not everything is black and white as we think it is, nor as straightforward as we've come to expect. Lucas encroached upon these ideas in the prequels, but never as effectively as in the Clone Wars, and largely because of his decision to tell this story as an anthology. A collection of perspectives that broadens our view of not just the conflict of the Clone Wars as a whole, but the themes running through the Star Wars universe. That's why every episode started with the Jedi fortune cookie. Each week offered viewers a chance to grow their perspective, just as the scenarios encountered by the characters in the show added to their perspective as well. It's good to know the differences between good and evil on a surface level, to know why Luke is good and Vader is bad, but more difficult than that, and arguably more important, is to know the difference when the signs are less obvious. It's the importance of questioning your superiors, holding your government accountable, forgiving your wrongdoing, and choosing your own path when you can no longer follow the ones set out before you. These are the themes that make Clone Wars accessible to anyone, and what makes this the most fascinating elaboration of Lucas's mythology ever made. Alternatively, the Clone Wars went on to have some of the most impressive 3D animation ever put on television. Even without the speed and efficiency of which the show was produced, it's truly amazing how Lucasfilm Animation and CG were capable of using such distinctively stylized animation to evoke deep emotional reactions to characters and moments. In spite of how rough that animation looked in the beginning, Lucas's vision for the marionettes-inspired design of the show paid off in a pretty incredible way. While the writers and directors brought a groundbreaking cinematic edge to each and every episode, the voice cast of the show practically poured their hearts into their characters and made them come to life right before our eyes. D. Bradley Baker made every clone stand out, Matt Lanter gave us a heroic Anakin, and James Arnold Taylor an ever-charming Obi-Wan. Sam Witwer made Maul three-dimensional, Ian Abercrombie made Palpatine deceptively powerful, and Ashley Eckstein perfectly captured the growth and evolution of Ahsoka. For every last nut, bolt, and drop of blood poured into the show, the Clone Wars became an ensemble of hardworking, passionate storytellers.
I think from animation, one of the great things was you never treated the animation as something separate or different. It was just all part of the story. And that meant a lot because a lot of times in animation, you delegate something else. Oh, it doesn't need to be as good. Or it's just that animation thing. And we kept pushing to say, but we want the visuals in the story to just be an extension of the films. That's art. That's evolving. You never want to sit still. I mean, that's why the last season of the show looks better than the first.
Growing up, my number one hero was probably Spider-Man, but my first actual hero had to be Dave Filoni. A fellow Pennsylvanian who wore a hat all the time and used the opportunities at his fingertips to tell impactful, moving stories. That could be me one day. And sure enough, one of the more startling realizations I had while rewatching the Clone Wars was seeing how much of my student films were influenced by the style of the show. The pacing, the rhythm of cuts and edits, the way certain shots were composed, or even the weirdly serious subject matter, all of that was hardwired into me as a kid. And the most amazing part is that I know I'm not alone. There's real power to what Filoni did in the Clone Wars. Stories and messages and characters that have not only affected me, but an entire generation of storytellers. As both Lucas's prodigy and a talented filmmaker, there's truly no one in the whole galaxy more deserving of leading Star Wars storytelling into the future than Dave Filoni. As for Filoni's best creation, one of the greatest Star Wars characters ever, allow me to gush over Ahsoka Tano. If you asked me as a kid who my favorite Clone Wars character was, I probably would have said Rex, Cad Bane, or Maul, but not Ahsoka. She just never seemed as cool as other characters, and I held that against her. But amazingly, when I rewatched the show, I found myself relating with Ahsoka like no other character in Star Wars, and realized just how profoundly she may have impacted me as a kid. When the Clone Wars first came out, I was going to a small Christian school of no more than 50 students across 8 grades. My worldview was exceptionally tiny, even for someone as young as I was. By the age of 12, I transferred to a public school with a massive student population, and that pretty much felt like I was drowning 24/7. I knew no one, and anyone I did meet didn't believe in the same things I did. Almost everything about my worldview was challenged. But that challenge was a good thing. It forced me to adopt new perspectives, to be accepting of others who didn't share my beliefs. It made me a stronger person, and more sure of my own values. But throughout high school, I started to question some of the other values I was raised on, and the people who taught me those values. It was hard to know if they wanted the same things I did, or if they were setting me up for failure. When all my friends went away to college, I took a gap year. I needed to figure out who I was first, what my path had to be. I eventually went to college in Philly, but I found myself frustratingly involved with people who didn't know better. It was a big learning experience for sure, but it made me confident in who I wanted to be. Since then, and since rewatching The Clone Wars, especially in its final season, I can't help but feel connected to Ahsoka. Her journey from being raised as a peacekeeper, to becoming a Jedi warrior, to eventually choosing her own path, is something I'm sure everyone can relate with in some way, but for me, no other fictional character understands me quite like Ahsoka does, and that's something I'm unimaginably grateful for. Lucas and Filoni gave young viewers this character so that they could see the war through her eyes, and learn the world through her trial and errors. And in doing so, I think she's had an immeasurably powerful impact. We are all Ahsoka. We all have the power to choose a path other than the one set out for us. And just like Ahsoka changed my world, we have the power to change others. How beautiful is that? To Dave Filoni and Ashley Eckstein, who made Ahsoka what she is today, one of my all-time favorite characters, all I can say is thank you. The Clone Wars is a story about perspective, a story about a labor of talented artists and creators, a story about inspiring a generation of storytellers, and a story about choosing your own path. However, there's one more story the Clone Wars tells, one about its creators. I believe that, for any artist, the art they make will inevitably reflect who they are. And not just for Dave Filoni, but the entirety of Lucasfilm Animation, The Clone Wars is a story about inheriting a mythology. The mythology of Star Wars storytelling. When this studio began working on The Clone Wars, they knew practically nothing about what they were supposed to do. It was an uphill battle from the start, and they made many mistakes early on. Under the apprenticeship of George Lucas, a flawed filmmaker but a gifted visionary and an innovator no less, Filoni and Lucasfilm Animation learned from their mistakes, applied what they learned, and created something much bigger than themselves. They became so good at making Clone Wars that the show began to lift up the prequels and shed a new light on Lucas himself. Up until a corporate vision consumed the property, and the studio was quite literally forced to walk away from Lucas's vision. Things were different during the production of Rebels, but using what they knew, Lucasfilm Animation quickly made the most of their limited resources and produced more meaningful Star Wars storytelling. After fan demand and permission from Disney, they returned to their roots, The Clone Wars, the show that gave their studio its start. They were given their very own version of the blue lightsabers, the same art style and studio resources, but now even better. And then, before telling that story, they said goodbye to their mentor one last time. The man who handed them this mythology and the responsibility of telling stories for generations to come. Now granted, some of this analogy probably hinges on how you feel about Disney's ownership of Star Wars, but if there's anything we can all agree on, it's that Lucas's mythology will go on. The future of Star Wars, where it matters, is in good hands. And thankfully, there's no shortage of stories to tell either. Jon Favreau's The Mandalorian, Respawn's Jedi Fallen Order, and Lucas Press's High Republic all demonstrate the legacy of Lucas's storytelling. With any luck, the true power of the story will be felt for generations to come, and promote a world where we all feel like we belong. Thank you, George Lucas, Dave Filoni, and the cast and crew of The Clone Wars for everything you've ever done. The legend, the brilliance, the legacy of Star Wars The Clone Wars lives on forever. Hey everyone, congratulations for making it to the end of the video, I guess. Just talking to you guys non-scripted for a few last closing remarks before you click off the video. First and foremost, I have to thank everyone for watching these videos. We've more than doubled our subscriber count since we started doing this series back in March, I believe, was when we uploaded the first video. And yeah, it's been quite a journey making these 3 videos. I had no anticipation for making this when the year started. I began rewatching the Clone Wars back in December, and I think halfway through my rewatch, probably by the end of January, I was like, oh my god, someone needs to be talking about these things. And much to my surprise, when I went on YouTube and, you know, looked for videos about this stuff, there's people talking about the lore and stuff like the Mortis arc and the Yoda arc, but no one was really talking about like the show itself, like the content and the themes and the stuff that all the other Star Wars films done by Lucas are so laden with. No one was applying that to the Clone Wars, and that was shocking to me, because this is very much a Lucas property. You know, this is something that has his fingerprints on it. So I, you know, resolved to fix that issue and fill that void, and hopefully I've done that, and hopefully over time these videos get the views that would help people to understand the series for what it is. But if nothing else, I've really enjoyed making these videos, and I've enjoyed talking to all of you about it, and just all the really positive feedback I've gotten from these videos. It's been a big blessing for sure, and it gives me a lot of reassurance going forward that we're going to continue to do really great things on the channel. That being said, during my video I mentioned that there were about 52 unproduced episodes, or 13 4-part arcs that were not adapted. Well, after the show was finished, now there are 40 episodes, and that's still a lot, just given all the arcs that we know were written but never produced. And it's very unlikely that we'll ever see them as completed Clone Wars episodes. I stand by that, but that doesn't mean we won't be able to see them in other mediums. So that's why I'm going to promote #CompleteTheCloneWars. Send that to Dave Filoni and Matt Lanter and D. Bradley Baker and James Arnold Taylor and Sam Witwer and all these, the cast and crew of Clone Wars on Twitter. Remind them about the Clone Wars. You know, maybe they can't, you know, make these into full episodes, but when they see that hashtag, they will know, they'll be reminded of how these stories need to see the light of day somehow. Obviously, some of them are probably non-canon now. Like, I know there's the one with the Mon Cala arc where certain characters that was going to be alive or dead is now dead much later on in the future. But even still, these are stories that deserve to be told. So, Complete the Clone Wars, promote that. Other than that, I just want to talk about the immediate plan for the channel going forward. I understand a lot of you subscribed to me over the last few weeks because of these Clone Wars videos. And you're probably, you know, I'm going to anticipate expecting more Star Wars content on the channel. This is maybe a universe that you enjoy me talking about. Or maybe you're subscribed for animation. Or maybe you're subscribed just for me. If that's the case, I appreciate it the most. Whatever the case, I just want to promise to you, those of you who subscribed because I was talking about something Star Wars related, there will be more Star Wars videos in the future. However, it won't be in the next few videos I do. I do have a script for a Jedi Fallen Order video stewing. I've actually been working on it for a couple months now, or rather, I started it a few months ago. I haven't really touched it in a couple months, but I definitely want to talk about Jedi Fallen Order. That'll probably be a video that I do later in the summer, and then of course later in the fall, closer to the fall I should say, I will be doing a video on Star Wars Rebels. So much of that show shares its DNA with Clone Wars, and after talking about Clone Wars at the length that I have, I really do want to dive into Rebels. Most likely not to the same extent as what we've done here, not over 3 videos, but still a thorough dive for sure. And then other than that, in terms of what you can expect going forward in the immediate next few videos, I am going to be doing a series of videos on blockbuster films, in essence of the fact that it's, you know, with the pandemic going on, so many films have been canceled that were going to come out this summer. I want to sort of fill that void by talking about some of my favorite blockbusters ever. Films like Raiders of the Lost Ark, Mad Max Fury Road, Jurassic Park. Just, you know, a lot of these classic blockbuster films that everyone grows up watching and just were huge events when they came out. I really want to reflect on that and look at that. We won't be talking about any Star Wars movies in there, though. After making these 3 videos, I have been incredibly intrigued by the mechanics, I think, of George Lucas's universe, and I really would like to talk about pretty much all the Star Wars films including the new trilogy. But that's probably a project that I will save for next year. So, as I said, plenty of Star Wars content to come. But for now, we're going to sort of change it up. I need a break from this universe, and so that when I come back to it, I feel renewed again. I've spent a lot of time just writing and editing Clone Wars content, so it'll be nice to come back to it, or step away from it and come back to it later on. So that's pretty much all I gotta say, guys. Thank you so much for watching. You are all the best. Stay tuned, stay subscribed, and I'll be seeing you all next time. Peace out, everyone.